Betsy, you're all ready?
I just got my coffee. I'm ready to go.
Perfect. Good. All fueled up. Great. So thanks everybody for joining us this week for the Minority Politics Online Seminar Series. This week, we're really happy to welcome Professor Betsy Levy Paluck from Princeton University, where she is a professor of both psychology and public affairs. Betsy does not know this, nor that I will ever say this, but I have a very vivid memory at my first SPSB of seeing her give a talk where she did this really ambitious field experiment, which really was like, oh, you can do that. That's cool. I didn't even know that that was a thing. And that was as one of the few talks that I remember from almost any conference, unfortunately, but that's just more my memory than anything else. So I'm really happy that she could come and talk with us today. For people who have questions as we go, if you have clarifying questions, put them in the chat and I'll try to direct them to Betsy as it makes sense. And for bigger picture questions, put them in the question and answer. We'll get those to those at the end. Thanks for coming. Thanks for giving your talk today, Betsy. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. You had me sweating a little bit when you said you wanted to share a memory about me at a conference.
I know, and one that you had no idea that I was even there or anything. So it's
Right,
very,
right.
it's really.
Overheard at SBSB. Oh, I was giving a talk on a field experiment. Oh, that sounds like me. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for having me. What a fantastic opportunity to speak to an audience like this, my favorite kind, psychology and political science. So this is terrific. I'm also looking forward to giving this talk because this is one of the papers that I'm just proudest of in the past few years. And I was just mentioning as everyone was filing in that this is the one blessing of Zoom for me, is that, you know, after recently having a baby, I didn't expect to be able to give this many talks on this paper and to get it out there in the way that I am trying to do so now. And so really invite your feedback, your follow-up, either, you know, on here or afterward, because I'm really thinking about this project and its implications now, and I'd love to do so together. And this is just published now 2 months ago in January in the Annual Review of Psychology with these fantastic people. Roni Porat, who is at Hebrew University. She was my postdoc when we did this project together. Chelsea Clark, who is an up-and-coming graduate student at Princeton. Please watch this space for her. And Don Green, who was my mentor in graduate school and ongoing collaborator. And so what we were asking in this paper is what works to reduce prejudice. This is a throwback to an earlier question that Don and I had posed when I was still in graduate school, reviewing the literature from sort of the beginning of time in psychology, starting it there, up until that present moment, which at the time was 2007. And so this is that paper. What we concluded in that paper, which really just kind of hoovered up the entire literature that we could find, unpublished, published, white papers, the gray literature, everything, was that we were missing experiments on prejudice reduction. That is, we really didn't have a grasp on any kind of causal identification. And so what we had, the best that we had, was descriptions of interventions that were going on in the world. We had a lot of experiments in the laboratory, but with completely unknown translation into the world. And so it was really a plea, with a few exceptions, and you can always consult that paper if you'd like to see things like cooperative learning that were standing out, but that was really a plea for more experimentation. And so what we decided to do is that it's been now a dozen years since that was published. We wanted to ask of the experimental literature from that time, what has happened in the last dozen years. So this paper really focuses on the causal identification question. What are interventions able to accomplish, either in the laboratory, in the world, and across all of the social sciences? So biomedical sciences included, what have we been doing the past dozen years? And what's their average effect? So unlike the previous, which was a narrative review, because we're just focusing on experiments, we're going to actually empirically meta-analyze this group of papers and then ask, can we answer the public's call to reduce prejudice in the world? And we posed this question before the public call got really loud. So this past summer, suddenly a lot more people were asking this question. So I think this is another reason why this paper is coming out at an ideal time. I'm not sure that it has ideal answers, and that's what I want to talk about today. So I'm just going to get right to the answers because this is Zoom and we don't have time to mess around. First of all, we've observed an uptick in prejudice reduction research over the past dozen years, and some of these papers are just going to become classics. I'm happy to say some of them are just fantastic. You're going to be teaching them in your intro psychology classes because not only are they outstanding instances of prejudice reduction, they're just outstanding instances of social science. Using psychological theory. And a lot of them, by the way, are political scientists using psychological theory to run these tests. Now, the modal research is very different from these future classics, and that's in part definitional, of course. But what concerns me is that they're different in a way that causes me not to trust the majority of the research out there. And in particular, some of our most popular prejudice reduction ideas, the ones that we as social scientists treasure the most, but also the ones that are getting the most currency or have the most currency out there in the world with the public, those ideas are not well supported by this literature, and I'm going to talk about the problems with that. And then this is, I think, the most damning conclusion, so saving that for the end, is that the most rigorous research in this population of studies, and I really do think we got the population, shows very small reductions in prejudice. Okay, I want to move on to talk about at the end what I think the next generation of prejudice reduction research looks like. So inshallah, if I am able to review this literature again in another 12, 24 years, what do I hope we'll see at that point? And then I want to also ask, as part of that, whether we're even using the right model of change. And this is really something that I'm thinking about based on this research. This is the least empirically supported move I'm going to make in this paper. This is more of my editorializing at the end and the challenge and the discussion that I want to have with everyone. Okay, so I'm going to now spend the rest of my time just trying to support those conclusions and show you how we got there. So first conclusion that I mentioned to you is this uptick in prejudice reduction research. And what this figure is showing you is that there's been an uptick in most types of research split up by methodology. So that black line shows you how it's rising from 2007 to 2019, the last time we searched. And that's driven mostly by lab studies and online studies. Field experiments, unfortunately, are toggling around at the bottom of about 1 to 3 field experiments on prejudice reduction per year. The way we got our population of studies, this is too small to show you, but it's a Prisma chart just to demonstrate that we were using and following very rigorous standards for our meta-analysis, biomedical standards, such that our search, our analysis are completely replicable. And so we have our search terms, all of our data encode on Dataverse. So please do go see that there, including this Prisma chart, which shows you all along the way, if you're unfamiliar with Prisma charts, how we narrowed down our initial cache of studies that we found. We did search 5 different databases. One was a proprietary text-based algorithm, which can't be replicated. And we got to over 16,000 results, which resulted in a very fun summer, a narrowing down research studies summer that we got down to about 1,800, which the PI team reviewed in full. Our criteria was to look for studies that were trying to reduce prejudice, broadly defined as animus. So that could be in terms of behavior, emotion, attitude, social norms. We excluded, following our previous review, studies aimed at reducing sexism, mostly because that really springs, those interventions and that thinking, rightly or wrongly, springs from a bit of a siloed literature. And so we left that out of the initial review. We left out in this review partisan interventions, which is a very new and will be, I predict, a rapidly growing literature. But since that didn't really come up in the last review, we left that out as well, but watch that space in it too. We also left out collegiate bias. And so you're not going to see reports of any studies in here, mediating between Ohio State and Michigan students. But they all had to be experimental. So those were our criteria. And our final sample resulted in 418 experiments over the past dozen years. All of the experiments were coded by a team. Anyone coding these studies had to have at least a master's degree, and then the PI team did a lot of coding ourselves. And one thing I should mention here is that while all of this is up on Dataverse, what we've just gotten a grant to do is actually to build a website that is a clearinghouse and hopefully kind of a meeting place for gathering this research, posting all of the studies within all copyright law that we can push to its limits, and then to continue gathering research as we go forward, for a place for researchers to gather. Okay, so the next thing that I told you is that several prejudice reduction studies are just destined to become classics. So I love talking about this. They're going to be classics because they're really robust and what I'm calling realistic interventions. So they're not pared down proofs of concept that kind of manipulate one thing, show that another thing changes, and now we're just wondering whether we could use this. They're really interventions that take into account social and psychological, sometimes even political processes. And so that's what I mean by realistic. They're well described. You can just imagine using them, right? And then they're tested with robust methods. And if you know my previous work, you know why I care a lot about this, but they have large sample sizes. They measure behavior as well as attitudes. They attend to randomization. So if there's attrition, they know what to do about that rather than just to do a t-test of the surviving members of the treatment and control teams at the end. They're pre-registered, they use open data. They're just really exemplary in so many ways. So let me tell you about a few of them. But before I get to that, I want to say that despite some really varied theoretical approaches that these classics take, one thing that they have in common is that they all report promising but pretty small positive outcomes. And this gives you a bit of a preview of what our meta-analytic estimate would look like if we weighted this study by quality. And in fact, we're not going to do any weighting in this study at all, but I am going to show you some quality checks. Here's one of the, here's the first pair of studies I want to tell you about that are going to become classics. These are two doctoral students, Matt Lowe and Sama Musa. The science cover, of course, is where Sama Musa's paper landed this summer, testing conditions of contact in the field, one in northern Iraq with Christians and Muslims, and the other in India with high and low caste men. And in fact, both studies cover men being integrated with one another. What we love about these studies is that they're well-powered and they measure a whole range of outcomes that really push forward our thinking about the contact hypothesis in various ways. So measuring things like economic cooperation and not just social interaction, but the social interaction goes far outside the bounds of the intervention. So going to different neighborhoods with people who are not players in the league, and then measuring things like policy attitudes, which, by the way, they don't, Sama Musa doesn't find changes in policy attitudes, which is, I think, a null that leads us to a very productive discussion about what the contact hypothesis was even originally meant to do. And then speaking of what the contact hypothesis was meant to do, one of the things was to propose conditions of contact, as I mentioned at the beginning. And you might be surprised to know that despite the long history of the contact hypothesis, almost no experiments, not just field experiments, have tested the need by experimentally by manipulating the need for these conditions. And that's precisely what these experiments do, in part by testing whether or not you're in this condition of cooperation, not just contact, with members of the outgroup. Are they on your team, or are you having contact with them by playing with them in the league, but you're playing against them? Another study that is a real standout is Kevin Munger's, who took advantage of, I think, that time period's lower awareness of Twitter bots and tested ideas about confrontation and whether confrontation can reduce expressions, prejudiced, racist expressions. And so on Twitter, Kevin went and found white men who were using the N-word as a racial slur, and then confronted this group of men who had actually done so on Twitter naturalistically by having them be confronted by one of 4 Twitter bots in a very nice 2x2 manipulation. The Twitter bots were all identified as men, but they were identified either as Black or white by their avatars, and then as high or low status as manipulated by their number of followers, and wanted to test who was best at reducing the expression of these racial slurs, these racist slurs, and measured out, weeks and weeks after the confrontation, whether there was a repeat use of the slur. Then finally, this study tested whether online diversity training, so these one-off online diversity trainings, work. We may have our various opinions about whether we would expect them to work, but I'll tell you, and you'll see that this is one of the only studies to ever test that question. They did so by collaborating with a multinational corporation, at a huge sample, one of the only studies in our sample to be able to test with any degree of power heterogeneous effect sizes. One thing they find is that indeed, the effects of this diversity training were felt only on what many people might call the converted, on women and people of color themselves who work at this corporation. One of the other things I really appreciate about this study is that they used administrative data, and bravely, when they found that the corporation wasn't collecting the kind of administrative data they needed, they went ahead and created opportunities for people at the corporation. So actually set up a kind of, coffee with a mentor type program to be able to test whether people would use that with an underrepresented colleague. So a brave study and a much needed one. Okay, so then the next point I made to you was that the modal type of research is very different. And this is a bar chart just showing you how we've classified the various approaches taken by these interventions. And these are approaches or bins that were defined by the research team after knowing, what's out there. The first one that is, far and away the sort of plurality of all the studies is extended and imagined contact. And one thing that just bowls me over by this category is that it didn't even exist in my previous review. So, this is a new category, and it has taken over, pretty much a third of all prejudice reduction activity across the social and biomedical sciences over the last year. So if for those of you who don't know what this is, it's definitely not going to Northern Iraq or India. It's asking people to think about friends who have friends from outgroups, or just to imagine their own contact. So to imagine themselves having a conversation, say, if you're a white American, imagine having a conversation with a Black American. The next category is cognitive and emotional training. And these are all types of interventions that ask people to take sort of mental and emotional regulation strategies as a way of diminishing their prejudice. The next one is social categorization. It's very similar, but it's also a bit more specific. There are enough studies to make its own category, because these are manipulations where you're asked to kind of redraw group boundaries in your mind. So to think of someone as part of your group rather than part of an outgroup, because you all share a certain kind of trait or social trait. Okay, so you can see all the rest of the categories. Maybe you have a favorite one in there. You can see how popular that one has been. The reason I really want to bring this up right away about the modal type of research is that, first of all, it seems that the mode of all of our prejudice reduction efforts, research-wise in the past dozen years, has been to mentalize our way out of prejudice. So what do I mean by that? It's a very individualized approach focused on that individual's mental life, right? So imagine something, reclassify someone, try to regulate your thoughts or feelings, right? And we actually had a coding category that is not the same as mentalizing. We had a coding category called light touch, which is jargon that we borrow from the policy literature, where we had a very specific definition of what a light touch intervention was. It had to be easy to implement, brief, and cheap, okay? You could also call it the nudge of interventions, but it's not quite the same thing as nudge, but I think that will come to people's minds. There are a lot of sort of intersections between nudges and light touch interventions. What we find is that 76% of all interventions in the past dozen years could be classified as light touch. And then finally, the other way in which the modal research is very different from our classic studies is what gives me pause. And we're going to get to that next, but it's the methodological problems. So lots of small sample sizes, a great deal of attrition that's not being handled in a way that anyone would recommend. There's a lot of cluster randomization, but then analysis at the individual level without attention to the clusters and to their intercorrelated error, which really overestimates the effect size. And then such an enormous lack of transparency in terms of reporting on, clearly on main effects. In the paper, usually people are reporting most directly on heterogeneous effects without any pre-registration of those interactions or subsample analyses. Okay. So this is just probably a too small depiction of the entire sample. So I'll just, verbally tell you a few other ways to describe this population of research and the modal research. In terms of types of outcomes, still the most popular outcomes are explicit attitudes or beliefs. So despite the rise in calls for measurement of behavior, despite the popularity of looking at implicit bias, those two are under 10% of all outcomes measured, both of those categories that I just mentioned. We as researchers are still measuring or intervening on race and ethnic prejudices the most, followed by ability. And then I think a surging category is immigrants, asylum seekers, refugees, migrants, for obvious reasons. And then finally, the intervention settings, as you would expect from the popularity of lab and online studies, is college and MTurk settings. Okay. Here's the average effect. So I told you we would get to that. It's D equals 0.357 with a standard error of 0.02. In case you're not fluent in D, let's think about what that means. If you were to take a feeling thermometer, which is one of the more popular self-report measures of prejudice in this literature, where 0 is you feel very cool toward an outgroup, say Black people, and 100 is you feel very warmly toward them. Let's take someone with what you would judge as like a really mild prejudice, like just under neutral. So someone at a 40, this would move them to a 48. Okay. So I'll pause there because it's interesting to reflect, is that what we want? I mean, in some ways, I've just told you that all of these interventions are pretty light touch, or excuse me, not that the majority of these interventions are pretty light touch. So if the average intervention out of that, population produces this 8-point change, right? If we translated it as such, that doesn't sound too bad at all. Okay, and there's a lot of talk out there about, recursive processes. If you start something in motion, it will build over time, et cetera. So what I want to do now is I'm going to look at this effect size again, and I want to look at it in a way that absolutely takes out any judgment. So I've already been a little judgy. I've been telling you about all of these methodological problems that I am seeing, and I'm complaining about those. I'm just not going to put my hand on the scale at all. I'm just going to break up this population of studies into quintiles by sample size. Okay, so sample size is a pretty low bar method of, or a very simplistic method, let's say, of judging study quality. Okay, so this is really going to be splitting up the population to look at the average effects within different quintiles of study quality as measured only by sample size. Okay, so first I'm going to show you the table. Let me orient you to this table, which is probably small for a lot of you. The quintiles are reported in the leftmost column, right? So it says treatment sample size. This is in that quintile, how many people on average were in the treatment group. So as you'll see, the bottom quintile is 25 or fewer people in the treatment group. That's really small. The top quintile of treatment sample size is 78 or more. That's still really small, right? So you can already see that, I wasn't kidding when I said that this, population of studies has small sample sizes. So that is, the top quintile, the groups of studies with the most, and we've got some big outliers there. So they're even, this is summarizing across all of them. So now I want to look at the effect size column. Now, if we are not worried about publication bias, the effect size should not track the sample size at all, right? Because it's a telltale sign of publication bias if the studies with very small samples have a very big effect size, because that means they have to find something big in order to be published, right? But unfortunately, this is exactly what we find. So what we see is that studies with 25 or fewer people in the treatment group have an effect size, on an average effect size of 0.6, which is almost double what we find on average. But if you look all the way down, it's sort of a linear pattern. It follows that studies with 78 or more people in them report an average effect size of 0.18. Okay, so I'm just going to show you that again now graphically for those of you who prefer figures. And you can see this, sort of linear trend in which the smallest effect sizes, the Cohen's d, track toward the studies with larger samples. So in this telling, the more high quality studies. What does that mean? So let's take the most rigorous studies here, that top quintile of sample size. The D of 0.187 now takes you from a 40 to a 44. Okay, so again, worth a pause to figure out, like, well, are we satisfied with this change? Again, it's probably a one-off small intervention, right? This figure is to show you all the different classifications of different interventions. This is the average effects per category of intervention. Now, this is with the entire sample, okay? And this is now only looking at the studies with the top quintile in terms of sample size for each category. And you can see this move to only include the top quintile affects every single category of research. I should also mention we find the same pattern when we just look at laboratory studies, when we just look at field experiments, when we just look at online studies. Okay. My other conclusion, moving on, is that some of the most popular prejudice reduction ideas are not well supported, okay? And I want to actually look back at this last screen. Again, these are the studies with 78 or more people in the treatment condition. I want you to look all the way down at the bottom category, which is diversity trainings. There are only 2 studies of diversity trainings that have 78 or more people in the treatment group. Now, when you think about diversity training, you might reflect on how this is the one intervention that is called for in our public life when a racist, a sexist, event involving religious bias, et cetera, happens, is we call for trainings, right? And so this is what I'm showing you is the evidence base for those trainings if we want to focus on causal impact of these trainings, okay? What about implicit bias? Another really popular category of training out in the world. There is a growing literature on implicit bias training. And by the way, implicit bias trainings were included in that diversity training category that I just showed you. But it's very small, so I don't think that we're ready to say that we have a strong evidence base for implicit bias training yet. The other aspect of implicit bias that we were very interested in is we thought, well, regardless of what kind of intervention you have, won't it be interesting? There's been lots of meta-analyses of, whether implicit bias can predict behavior. But here's a new way to look at it. What if I run any kind of intervention? It could be a mass media intervention. It could be social categorization intervention, empathy, et cetera. And what if I affect behavior? Well, does implicit bias also change? Or in other words, what's the functional interdependence of implicit bias and behavior following any kind of an intervention? We were very excited to test this, and I'm sorry to say that there were only 2 studies in our entire database that measured both implicit bias and behavior as an outcome measure. So I cannot tell you what the functional interdependence of these two social and psychological phenomena are, and political phenomena. All right, so then the final popular idea that I think is very popular in the academic literature in particular is that small changes build over time. This is what I alluded to before, is this, maybe I think it's very popular for psychologists to call it a recursive process by which you get this really tiny change, but then that's well supported and reinforced by social processes as you go, and it builds on itself. And it's been used to explain some of these surprising studies out in the world where there's been a very minor intervention and an effect that you see much farther on down the road. This is not an issue of an absence of, there's no evidence of absence of this effect, right? So in other words, what we did in this meta-analysis is that we tracked every single longitudinal effect, right? We took as many effect sizes from every paper as we could. So up to 5 outcome measures we measured, and we went with the outcome measures that authors mentioned in their abstract. So this is really like sort of giving the authors the present of just believing them that these were always their most important measures. We'll take whatever you reported in the abstract. But except for this case, if you mentioned any kind of longitudinal measurement at all, we took it and we put it in a special category so that we could try to test whether or not we see effects lasting over time. If we can speak to this idea that small changes can build or even just maintain. And unfortunately, there's a complete absence of evidence for this claim. So I think at minimum, we need to be very modest about invoking this hypothesis when we talk about and justify our rationale for pursuing these kinds of small effects, at least in prejudice reduction. Okay, so this is kind of a once more with feeling figure. I've already showed you these data, right? This is again the relationship between D and standard error. D is on the y-axis and standard error on the x. What I really want to just mention, what I really want to use this figure to do here is to fit a linear model to it and show you that the prediction line crosses 0. What does this mean? This means that based on the population of data that we have, if we were to say, you know what, we're rejuvenated here, we're going to just do the next generation of research, we're just going to use all the best methods, the most rigorous methods, large sample sizes, you know, et cetera, et cetera. This suggests that if we follow the same average approach that we've been taking, the most rigorous studies would find no change in prejudice, okay? So what should the next generation of prejudice reduction research look like? I just told you a lot. I've ended on a really sour note. We have many recommendations that are a little bit business as usual in our annual review paper. So we include suggestions for people, especially early career researchers, but really for everybody, for those who are, you know, their interests lie more in field work, their interests lie more in laboratory work. Both are valuable for moving forward. You know, just ideas about, you know, what theories to really investigate, what theoretical anomalies to pursue, and how to go about, you know, advancing the agenda. But I think that, you know, it's really hard to take all of these data in, all of these conclusions in about the possibility that, you know, better and better studies might find nothing or something very, very small. It's hard to take that in and not think that we really need to do something radically different here. And so my editorializing that I want to end on, and I feel free to push back on me, is that we really think that we need to think about a different model of change. And so this is a less developed idea, one that I'm just going to perseverate on a little bit and then end, is that maybe we should think more about intervening in structures, okay? So the current model of change, as I see it, is that prejudice is this psychological problem. And so in order to attack it, the intervention needs to match the problem, right? The medicine needs to match the illness. So let's concoct individualized psychological interventions to address this individual problem of prejudice in the mind in order to create this individual change, and then hopefully down the road, this societal change, right? Now, this is not to say that psychologists and political scientists don't conceive of structural racism and prejudice and the ways in which these are socially transmitted, but this is the change model that is implied by the collected work that that is out there. So the alternative model of change that I want to meditate on a bit is that what if we didn't match the illness, the medicine with the illness? What if we said, let's attack this psychological problem with structural interventions in order to try to create this psychological change? Note that I'm not trying to move us away from thinking about the mind. I think that the psychology of this is very important. I think that bias, I think that implicit bias, I think that, bigotry, explicit and implicit, is a very important problem to attack. But what if we were to attack it with structural interventions instead, and test whether that's creating some of that individual psychological change as well as societal change? Okay. So what do I mean by structural interventions? Obviously, and I think, this is especially obvious to all political scientists, this involves institutions, rules, leaders. We have tons of theories about these people, these organizations, and the decisions and the communications that are emitted from those. But I also mean social structures. And so I mean any kind of lever that we have that essentially changes the experience of a collective. Right? So that's what institutions do, among other things. That's what leaders do. But other kinds of social structures, unofficial organizations, mass collective experiences and gatherings, and by unofficial organizations, I'm talking about something like Black Twitter, right? There's no board of directors. There's no sort of institutional home that we could study. But what does this sort of collectivity do in terms of affecting perceptions, norms, attitudes, right? Goals, emotions, et cetera, right? So these are the types of social structures, I think, that have the possibility, interventions done with these kinds of social structures have the possibility to affect a lot of people, either simultaneously or asynchronously. And I'd like to think about whether interventions using structures have a greater impact on our individual psychologies and not just on our societies. I think we're more used to thinking about their impact on our societies rather than our individual psychologies. Although economic historians have been thinking more about this lately. I'm going to get to that. This is going to be challenging because I think that behavioral theory, I'm just going to call it behavioral because, it's in political science as well as psychology, only sometimes relates to structure, right? So a lot of our prejudice reduction theories aren't obviously related. So maybe let's start first with theories that are partially related. So an example of that would be social norms theory. And a prediction there is that leaders can signal new norms about the unacceptability of prejudice. And so you could think, following from that, about interventions that are both structural in nature, but less structural. So I'm just going to give these examples to help you think through how I'm thinking about it initially. So the structural intervention that we've been very interested in our lab, for example, are Supreme Court decisions. So we've been using regression discontinuity analysis or time series regression discontinuities to follow the same people longitudinally and see whether there is this discontinuity when the Supreme Court announces decisions based on the rights, contested rights, liberties of minoritized or stigmatized groups, right? Now, a less structural intervention that would still follow that prediction, but that is more individualized, would be to send emails to people reminding them of the progressive orientation of their leader, right? And so I think that's sort of more standard fare for what's happening in the prejudice reduction literature right now in terms of individualized interventions. But what about individually oriented theories? So a really popular one these days is perspective taking theory. So the prediction that, getting the perspective of outgroup members either through imagination or listening to their narratives can reduce prejudice. There's been ways in which we've brought this into more structural interventions lately, though. And so another landmark study that I didn't mention today are a set of studies, a series of studies, actually, that probably many of you know, that David Brockman and Josh Kalla have been doing in terms of canvassing. What's structural about this? Well, it's not just that, when a canvasser reaches the door of a potential voter, that they engage in this perspective taking and perspective getting exercise in a dyadic way. So this is a social process. It's not just an individual trying to imagine a perspective. It's also the case that the person who's answering the door is aware that this is part of an official canvassing strategy, that everyone else in their neighborhood is doing the same exercise, right? So this is what I mean about this sort of collectivizing experience, and what game theorists and psychologists and political scientists have been very interested in, these types of interventions that establish new common ground, a common understanding, right? So this is a way in which sort of a really individualized theoretical perspective has been, made into more of a social structural intervention. And then, to contrast that, would be more standard fare to text, sort of nudge-like messages to people to stimulate their perspective getting. And we see a lot of that out there. Okay. As I mentioned, I think economists have been really interested in this idea of institutions to psychology lately. So we've been seeing papers on how, with sort of economic history, looking at how institutions of slavery have affected ideology up until today. We've also seen field experiments on how randomized rollout of government reform have changed things like gender bias. But I really think that this is something that social and political psychologists have not been taking up. So in order to get there, I think we need to improve our skills at thinking about structural expressions of our theories. I don't think we need to throw out our theories. I think we need to understand how they relate to collective experience and try to realize that in interventions. I think that we need to be more collaborative. And I think, I see a lot more papers published with author groups, but I think that they're not as interdisciplinary as you would maybe need to realize this kind of more ambitious, bold intervention research. I think that it would be really interesting to think, especially for those of you who are interested in lab research, what kinds of R&D do we need in order to affect these kinds of interventions, right? And so one question that a lot of people ask are, well, this sounds kind of more top-downy, this sounds pretty big and bold, what about backlash? How would you frame these kinds of interventions? How do leaders introduce them? And I think, I don't think that's a stumbling block. I think that's an opportunity for doing really important research. I think, we can have an interesting normative discussion about how this involves us in the push for equity reform, not just on a normative basis, on a values basis, but also on the basis of, let's see whether or not this, cures some of our social ailments, some of our rot in society. This is also an opportunity for social science. So please, we would like to push this along for that reason too. Not that we need more reasons, but I think it engages a lot of people opportunistically in research as well. And then finally, I think, obviously we're always growing methodologically. It's just another invitation for everybody to get educated or to collaborate with folks who use a real variety of causal identification strategies, because some of these tests are going to not be as available to our traditional 2x2 randomized, experiments. I'm going to end there. I'm actually not sure my time. I wasn't monitoring that carefully, but I hope I still have time to take questions. So thank you very much. And just a reminder that you can find all of the papers, data, and code up on Dataverse under our names.
Great. Thank you very much. Your timing is actually close to perfect. So great talk and perfect timing. Couldn't ask for more. We have a bunch of questions. So I'm just going to jump in and we'll see how many we get to, I think. So the first couple of questions are about some of the ways that things were measured in the studies that are in the meta-analysis. So the first one is relatively short, but just when thinking about the explicit attitudes that are often included in these studies in the meta-analysis, do they primarily include cognitive type measures, or are these more affective and emotional, or what kind of measures, and does this make a difference in any way?
Thank you for that question. I do believe that we classified emotions in a separate category. So we don't have just explicit self-report all lumped together. So we did want to do a more fine-grained analysis of emotion versus attitude. And so I think that the answer to that is hard to say, because we did not actually do a separate analysis of emotions versus attitudes. We took an averaging approach for each study. So we identified up to 5 outcomes for each study, averaged them, and then so each study has its average effect. But that's something you could do yourself with our data if you were interested.
Awesome. Thank you. The next question is from Claire, And what they ask is so I've been thinking a lot about is a choice of outcome variables. In political science, we've been socialized to prioritize behavioral over attitudinal measures. But how should we think about which outcome measures matter? And what do you think about the need to do more work on the link between attitudes and behaviors?
Oh, that's so surprising to me. Because I actually see a ton of attitudinal outcomes in political science research. It's wonderful news that you're being socialized to measure behaviors. Like, please, like, go for it. But definitely measure both. I think that um, it's always useful to know what is the interdependence between these two things. I think that we need to keep measuring both, because I think that the science and the creativity of behavioral measurement is just getting better. And so the more data we have measuring both in a single study, the better we'll know. I think that, up till now, we've seen that, behaviors don't follow from self-reported attitudes very strongly. And yeah, there's always question about to what extent there's just like insane amounts of error that drive this gap, but can't be driving it completely.
Great, thank you. So the next one is about this is also kind of a does this make a difference question for the meta-analysis, but Kavan asks, did you review any developmental research or how the effect sizes varied by age? Perhaps what opportunities do you see for interventions that target children or adolescents?
So we did, and they are included in there. So
Okay.
actually, I don't can everyone? I guess people can still see my screen,
Yep.
right? So
Yep.
uh, if you look at intervention settings, you see we even divided up by middle, elementary, preschool, daycare, kindergarten settings. They were, populous enough for us to even have those as separate categories.
Okay.
Educational researchers have always had a, near and dear place in my heart, because they were some of the only folks doing field experiments, even in like the 70s and 80s. They were running RCTs with cooperative learning interventions, which were mostly achievement based, interventions with the goal of increasing achievement and learning. But they also had this rich theory around how they could support school desegregation and integration and bring students together. And so there's a pretty robust literature there, but there's a lot of stuff that goes on in schools. A lot of reading interventions, a lot of social categorization interventions, especially as young children are, at the stage of really learning these categories. I don't know. I think that I've just showed you how weak I think a lot of this evidence is. So I think what's hard is then going back and saying, well, then what do we know about this versus that? We were just dividing up what I see as somewhat of a disappointing literature. But that's not to say that the ideas out there are disappointing. I think they're rich, and there's a lot of work going on. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that this kind of question raised for me personally was that there's some work that suggests that attitudes are more malleable, at least when you're a bit younger than once you kind of go through university and are in your, 20s and 30s, and it starts to get much more stable. So you could maybe imagine that things could move around a little bit more early on, but I don't know if that actually would play out with these interventions or not.
Well, I think that, another thing that's relevant to add here, since we're doing a lot of focusing on attitudes, is that one of the theoretical anomalies that we think that, the next generation of prejudice reduction research should pursue is the fact that a lot of field experiments are finding behavior change without attitude change. Now, why is that? And what should we think about that? Is that showing a deficiency, or is that just showing, that attitudes are performative? They are things that we own, and we can discard them eventually if they don't fit with our behaviors. I myself come from an orientation that focuses more on norms, because I think that it's all well and good to hold tolerant attitudes, or attitudes of liking toward a particular group. I think that if you find yourself in a community where those attitudes are not considered typical or desirable, you're less likely to act on them. And that's one of the reasons for this attitude behavior gap. So, norms in my own research, I find, are quite flexible. They change quite rapidly. Once you observe public behaviors, you can infer from that, especially if they're coming from powerful people in the community, what behaviors and what attitudes are permissible there. So, I think that's the only downside to thinking about this sort of socialization literature, is that, are we pursuing the right outcome? Just circling back to this question.
Right.
If you're someone like me who favors looking at, the reproduction, the, sort of ongoing dynamic, process of a normative culture, you'd be looking toward different things. You'd think that it can change, pretty rapidly, even for adults as well as for children.
Okay.
But these are really fun debates to have, and
Yep.
we need a lot more evidence for them.
Yeah, I mean, it's always fun to debate them, but it'll be nice to have some evidence to go along with the debates. Yeah. So the next couple of questions are kind of methodologically related, and kind of ways forward, and so on. So the first two come from Daniel Hopkins, who asks, is there a tension between an emphasis on structural interventions, where the units are often social groups and there are problems of spillover, and an emphasis on well-powered studies with large Ns?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yes, I think that there is definitely a tension there. And that's one reason why, well, I mean, we're still not even seeing well-powered studies with individuals, but imagining going from that, space to well-powered, larger scale studies, it does seem like a big leap forward. It is one reason why I'm calling for more collaborations. I'd like to see us, using a kind of like, let's all share the telescope model, where we're really working and trying to pull together as a group of social scientists to study big things. But I think that if we're not even getting people to use large sample sizes yet with individuals, we've just got a bigger structural problem ourselves as academics. Like, why is that? I don't think that people set out to do research that's underpowered. I think people really want to know the answers to these questions. I think there's a problem with resources. I think there's a problem with statistical education. I think there's a problem with publishing incentives. So I think now I'm just sort of getting into like a lot of well-trod, points from our, transparency and open science field as well. But I do think that collaboration and solving some of these other problems with education incentives is key.
Yeah, that makes sense. This actually is a good answer to a question that was coming up anyway, so I'll just get to skip one later.
Can I say a quick thing on that? Can I
sure, of course.
I think the other thing that occurs to me, and I know that Dan is really involved in these efforts, is that when psychologists and political scientists are sitting at the table, but I think this is especially the case of psychologists at policy tables right now, I think psychologists are often thought to be there because they're going to suggest low-hanging fruit, light touch interventions. Like, it's almost become that, like, that's what behavioral interventions are synonymous with. Whereas I think I want us to become better known for looking out for, like, what are the behavioral issues within large scale interventions, so that we have a seat at the table. What are the politics and social processes that we can advise on as like larger scale interventions are being constructed, rather than like, let us propose an intervention. I don't know that we're very good at that right now. I think that I just showed that the last 12 years shows we're not very good at that. So, or that we don't have those access points. And so I'd like us to be known in policy circles for different things. And I know Dan knows this very well. This is not something I'm saying about his research. I'm saying it as a general research trend and policy application trend.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think we've seen that with many of the different changes that have come on with COVID, where a lot of there's been these big structural type things that have changed, where I think that some ways psychologists could contribute is more like, hey, here's some ways that we could make these big structural things go a bit smoother, as opposed to here's the psychological intervention that will solve your big problem.
Right. Right.
So The next question comes from Carol, who asks, in light of your conclusions about models of change and targeting structures, I'm curious whether you're thinking about the value of different kinds of study outcomes has changed at all. When, if ever, might it be desirable to target desired behaviors more directly rather than via attitudes in the short or longer term? Do you feel that there is a behavior first pathway for changing important attitudes and policy positions?
I'd like to see a lot more research that targets behavior first, and then measures the social political attitude, correlates of those behavior. Absolutely. I think that we all want to see that. I think that we all want to see change in the world. Like, I think that these studies are aimed explicitly at changing the world, and that people want to see evidence that would convince a skeptic. And the evidence that would convince a skeptic are seeing actual behavioral modifications, rather than cheap talk. So I think that that's possible. I think that we're already starting to find some of that, actually, sometimes by accident and not design, just that behaviors are changing, but not the attitudes that you thought would drive them. And so,
Right.
I don't think I have anything else to add to that, except to encourage that notion in that direction.
Yeah, so that's nice. So this actually, so it kind of falls onto the next question I have by Joanna Volhart, who is also asking about these outcome measures. People are interested in what to think about these outcome measures, and so she points out that you mentioned briefly some outcomes that focus on economic cooperation. This is in one of the future classics you discussed. But do you think that other outcomes related to concrete policy support and redistribution of resources and that sort of thing would maybe be more informative than just feeling thermometers and this kind of like-dislike kind of measure?
So I think that I'm really excited about those measures. I don't know how to weigh their relative value necessarily, except to say that we've spent a lot of time measuring feeling thermometers, and definitely less time relating these interventions to policy attitudes. And that was one thing that really excited me, as I was talking about previously, so much about the Salma Musa intervention in northern Iraq, because she measured policy attitudes and found absolutely no change. And one of the things that I pointed out, I had been writing with Chelsea Clark, we wrote a perspective piece on her article, and we said, one really interesting thing is, if you look back at Gordon Allport, there's no mention that like contact should change people's ideas about collective action or about commonality between oppressed groups, or about, even though like authority intervention was deemed necessary for contact to be effective, there was no mention ever about how your orientation toward that authority might change as a result of your experience. And so there's really just no theorizing about this in the classic theory. And so, one way to think about that is it even fair to think that intervention should change these things, right? I mean, we just may need different theories to drive interventions that change those particular things, or not. I mean, but I think that we for sure have a lack of political and policy attitudes. So one classification was policy attitudes. We found so few that we didn't include it in the main meta-analysis, but we coded that and are going to go and look back. That's sort of on our agenda of next things to do with our data, is to look at these policy attitudes. So the small group of studies that measure them, to see what happened.
Cool. Thank you. So we have time for one more question. So this is from Ben Farr, who asks, who says first, thanks for a great presentation, and then asks, what is your advice for academics with limited financial resources who still want to do this bold research? If you can't afford a large sample, or, this is not in his question, but you can imagine a lot of these more complex studies, it's not just the large sample that's costly. What other quality dimensions are most important to improve?
Yeah. Thank you. So I think that, I keep mentioning collaboration, and I think that collaboration can happen in a few different directions. So it could be across departments where you're collaborating with more well-resourced colleagues at your own university. So, the economics department is just obviously the center of policy gravity, right? And is always more well-resourced for, for fair or less fair reasons. And so that's one direction to think about. Also, collaborating with political science or psychology colleagues at different universities. I think that we need a lot more sort of clearinghouses of the type that we're hoping to build with this grant, where we have a website where people who are interested in these projects can come and post on message boards and say, like, is anyone else interested in working on this? Like, should we all apply for a grant together? And then I think also thinking about collaborating with governmental, non-governmental organizations that are already doing these interventions. One thing I always point out to doctoral students is that some of these organizations already have, M&E, monitoring and evaluation budgets, or if those are pretty modest and you need to write a grant to collaborate with them, they're very motivated to work with you in order to re-up their own funding if they have, some sort of evidence procedure, evaluation procedure in the future. So I think the key is collaboration, but it could be with a lot of different entities. It could be with a number of those entities. But again, I very much commiserate because it is a structural problem in academia. We're still also rewarded for being sort of like the lone wolf investigator in many cases. And this is something that rests on those of us with tenure to change. So those of you who do have tenure, hear my cry. I think that, we need to help out all of ourselves. I think, the landmark studies that I mentioned to you, by the way, were all done and led by doctoral students. So, shame on us. We're the ones who have the resources. We should be doing these studies. And those were all doctoral students from well-resourced universities, right? So obviously, they still had the privilege of having resources available to them. But I know for a fact that they, fought, tooth and nail for every grant, small grant that they used on those projects. But nonetheless, this is an unfair process. It is sort of the telescope problem, right? We need to work together to grant lots of different scientists access to the tools and the opportunities that would allow a lot of different types of people, a real diversity of social scientists to work on this problem.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And what's nice is that it's not just one answer to the collaboration problem. There's a lot of avenues there. It's not, it doesn't have to be one route to make those things happen, at least, which is also nice. Thank you so much for giving us your time today and sharing your work with us. It was really a pleasure to hear your talk and to learn about your perspectives and your ways forward and so on. So thank you very much for presenting that. For everybody, please, you're welcome to join us next week, where Dylan will present on his work about demographic control in practice, everyday politics. Oh, sorry.
Her work. It's her
work. Sorry, I'm just plowing ahead. My mistake. Her work on demographic control in practice, everyday politics of land and property relations in Turkey's Kurdistan. Betsy will share all the people's comments and additional questions that we didn't